Brown v. Board of Education has come to be known as one of the most influential court cases and rulings for the civil rights movement. This case led to the start of reformation for equality in America for the people of all different races. This was especially important because of the unpromising background of life in the years leading up to this case in 1954.
From the earliest times, African Americans have struggled for equality. The African American race has been considered inferior to other races, especially to the white race. African Americans have been fighting for equality from 1619, when the first African American slave arrived in Virginia, to 2008, when the first African American president was elected. Slavery was legal, and the ban of importing slaves didn't happen until 1808. Since then, till about 1854, the tensions between anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions increased. Slave revolts continued, especially after the court ruling of Dred Scott v. Stanford in 1857. The court declared that Congress doesn't have the right to ban slavery in states. Therefore, it stated that slaves are not citizens. As tensions grew, the Civil War began in 1861 and ended in 1865. During this time period, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that slaves were free. The war ended in a victory for the Union. Therefore, in 1865, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau protected the right of newly emancipated African Americans. Although African Americans were free, they were still restricted the rights of citizenship. The Ku Klux Klan was formed, black codes were passed, and a series of Reconstruction Acts were issued. But then in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified. This amendment defined citizenship, saying that anyone born in the United States or naturalized in the U.S. are American citizens. The 14th Amendment nullified Dred Scott v. Stanford case in 1857. After this amendment was passed, it created more opportunities for African Americans. For example, in 1869, Harvard University became the first school in the United States to have an African American law school, and in 1881, when the first college for African American women was established. The level of equality increased when the 15th Amendment was ratified, which gave the right to vote to every man, no matter what race. Then in 1896, the court ruled that racial segregation was constitutional in the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson.
Plessy v. Ferguson was argued well before Brown v. Board of Education on May 18, 1896, and involved a challenge in the separate railroads of Louisiana, which at first seems unconstitutional to allow. However, the court ruled in a 7-2 decision that this was constitutional because it was apparently equal. This led to the well-known separate but equal principle. This principle was the apparent law of the land, as it controlled all of the Supreme Court case rulings for 55 years until the very beginning of the Brown cases started. There was a lot of action leading up to the final Supreme Court case in 1954, which had all started in 1951 when 13 parents filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. The argument was that all of the black schools that were provided for their children were miles away with no provided bus, while all white schools were very close nearby. The argument was also, how can allowing separation in children's schools solely based off the color of their skin be equal to those students? The group fighting for the 13 parents, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also looked back to the doll test done 10 years earlier by Kenneth and Mamie Clark that showed young African American children favoring white dolls over African American dolls due to the negative attitudes toward African Americans during school. The lack of availability was the original argument against the idea of separate but equal. However, the doll test and obvious lack of effort from school systems towards all black schools proved this principle couldn't be true, and that nothing was entirely equal in segregated schools. Although this case seemed promising, it was argued in favor of the Board of Education in Topeka's local courts in 1951, and argued in favor of the Board of Education for the first time in the Supreme Court on December 9th to December 11th in 1952.
But in 1954, the court ruling declared that separate but equal was unconstitutional and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In addition, the court stated that every American child has the right to an equal education integrating schools. This decision was not well supported by other citizens. 3 years after this decision, 9 black students were blocked from entering Central High by the National Guard in Arkansas. Then in 1962, James Meredith became the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi. This also caused chaos, forcing President Kennedy to send 5,000 federal troops to Mississippi to stop unsafe riots.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of 2 clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro.
Having integrated schools created many riots and chaos throughout the South mostly. Brown v. Board Education ruling guaranteed every American citizen a right to an education and one that is equal. This dealt with the civil rights and that African Americans have the right to an equal education that is protected by the national government. This court case affects America today because it creates equality for African Americans that they haven't had in the past due to their race. America still supports this equality in society today. In 2003, the Supreme Court ruled in Gutter v. Bollinger that race is a factor considered by colleges when selecting students. In other words, students in schools should accept all races in an even amount to have a diverse school. This enforces the court ruling in Brown v. Board Education because it guarantees integrated schools. Brown v. Board of Education was a major step into creating an equal education system. African American rights have been increasing since the early years with slavery. Today we have an African American president that was elected for 2 terms. There are still many racial issues still going on, but African American rights have changed immensely over the last 100 years, especially in education.